Right, so we are now moving on to the next part of Mao, which is the consolidation of power. We just finished with part one, which was the rise. And so this section of the consolidation focuses on, Chairman Mao and the People's Republic. Okay. So when looking at Mao, and just China in general, the People's Republic of China was declared in October 1949. Mao and the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, took measures to basically have full political control of the country. And the promises that were made were that they would be free of imperialistic powers, class division would be erased, and they would further the revolution and what they had preached during the revolution to the people. Keep in mind that while all of this is being promised, they still run a risk of being toppled by outside forces or even forces within. So, for example, the old government that was led by Chiang was now located in Taiwan, and they still claim that they were the rightful government or the legitimate government of China, right? The United Nations only recognized the government that was located as Taiwan as the legitimate government of China. Um, there was members within the CCP that threatened to destabilize the movement. They didn't really have a lot of experienced members within the party as well, so that they couldn't really point to somebody that say, "Hey, you run this and you run that," because most of the members were, peasants and people that were just only trained in military combat or trained to be soldiers. And there was threats of certain regions of China, threats of them separating themselves, right? And also land reform was being resisted by former landlords and upper class, middle class people. Next one. So the goal of the communists in China at this time was to just bring stability at first, right? So it's kind of like you have to take it step by step, paso por paso. So they asked former people who had been serving the governments who weren't really a threat and were just kind of going with the flow to stay behind as government officials or stay as police officers. The Chinese middle class was just kind of left alone for that moment. Um, and workers and industrial managers, they use them so that they can become that and kind of just bring stability during this era. The only people that were really kicked out or done something with were those who were like hardcore enemies, right? Hardcore enemies who posed a real immediate threat and were guilty of crimes in the past. So this is how the government was structured under this new republic, right? Under this the People's Republic. So you have 6 regions in China that are being divided by 4 major officials: the chairman, the party secretary, the military commander, and the political commissioner. You also see the PLA being formed, which is the People's Liberation Army. And so the last 2 groups were made up of people that belonged in the PLA. Overall, China was still centered and concentrated under the power of the Central People's Government Council, which made up 56 members. 6 of them served as chairman of the council, which was Mao. Mao was the undisputed leader. He was going to be the one to lead China from here on out until his death. There's this thing that is happening early on, which is the reunification campaign. So bringing stability means that making sure that you bring down any movement that is attempting to separate themselves. So you did have some parts of China that were like, well, we don't want to be a part of this anymore. And we never signed up for this. And we don't really agree with communism type stuff, right? So the CCP was like, no, the leaders in those regions are not going to make those decisions. And so they would go in to these regions and basically take control back. One thing that they did target was religion. And I know communism gets the rep of like being anti-religion. And it's not so much that China was anti-religion. It's just that there were certain religions that needed to be addressed in terms of what they preached, right? And so you had certain religions in China that represented reversing back into accepting the old authority and the old elite, and basically the feudal system that existed that would exploit people before Mao came into power. So the idea was to basically go into those regions, specifically Tibet in 1950, which had a culture that was adopted by India, right? In terms of Buddhism and all of that stuff. And so what they had also adopted in addition to those religious practices were the caste system. If you know anything about India, the caste system to this day still exists in India, where you as an individual are ranked and placed in a specific rank in terms of how important and how you are valued in society. And if you were in the lower caste system, in the lower ranks, then there's absolutely no there's even a category that still exists today of the untouchables, people you don't touch, right? Because they're just like so bad, they're the worst of society. It's just poor people, right? It's just poor people. But basically that's the label that was placed. And so Tibet had actually adopted a very similar caste system in their region, with the Tibetan Buddhists identifying their spiritual leader, naming them the Dalai Lama, basically at the top of that. So those who the Dalai Lama was at the top, and then it just kind of like the system is ranked, right, like a pyramid almost. And so Tibetan society was living under this feudal conditions. Like I said, the Dalai Lama sitting at the top of the hierarchy, and then the peasants at the there's people in between that, but the peasants at the very, very bottom, basically being used for slave labor, as you can see in that picture. And so there's this romanticization of Tibet even today, where it's like, well, we want to bring Tibet back to the olden days. I'm like, well, do you understand that the olden days represent slavery, kind of, But point is, at this time, you had those who were very loyal to the system and who benefited from the system, who had soldiers and people fight to keep that system alive. And so they fought China on that during this time period. But this PLA had bigger numbers, they were stronger, and they took them out and took control in 6 months. The Dalai Lama was forced to kind of retreat and leave. Another region that this happened to similarly was Xiangji, and basically they don't have Buddhists, but they have Muslims in that area. And so the concern was the Soviets were going to take control of the region in that area, and so China had to do something for that. Next one. So after 3 years in power, Mao begins to turn on the middle class. So it's like, okay, it's time to do this. And so in 1959, Mao announced the Reform 3 anti-campaign, and then extended it to the 5 anti-campaigns. So basically these campaigns were just there to target corruption, waste, inefficiency, sabotage within the government, sabotage within any of the industries, tax evasion, so not paying your taxes, bribery, fraud. So anything that the elites were doing before, that's what was targeted. So if you were rich and because basically you got to get away with all of this in the past. This campaign was like, you are middle class or rich and you were getting away with this before, but not anymore, right? Next one. So as part of these campaigns, Mao declared, reactionaries. Reactionaries are just people who are like in the middle class or upper class, who capitalist or conservative thinkers. So if you have reactionaries who want to take a more conservative approach, you would be labeled as a reactionary. But basically, reactionaries, along with counter-revolutions, were labeled as enemy of the state. English became a language of foreign exploitation, so they got rid of that. French street names were renamed from former, French, German. Remember, the Germans and the French and the English colonized multiple parts of China. So of course, a lot of the street names would be named. They would name a lot of the street names after their own language, right? In their own language. And then foreign names in cinema, jazz became not acceptable. So they started changing things to represent themselves. And then also they burned any book that romanticized that old system of feudalism, right? A time of slavery. So if you had a book or a textbook or a school book that basically said, yeah, like the olden days were so good. Like the system is so good. And I know you miss slavery. I know you miss that. Basically any book that said that or that glamorized or praised that was eliminated. They're like, no, we're not gonna let that happen anymore. Last one. So censorship was a big part of that because of that censorship of the romanticization of feudalism was in place. So a lot of newspapers were out of business, and only those who were left were people who were printing the very similar news. They knew what to print and they knew what not to print, so they learned how to self-censor themselves. They advertised the successfulness of the revolution, and people were actually not resistant to this at there, of course you're going to have some resistance, but for the most part, people were okay with this, and they were okay to be. Even the journalists were like, yeah, that's fine, because they felt like they were a part of a national movement of transformation. And then thought reform, government officials, factories, workshops, schools, and universities were re-educated to get away from that mentality of the past, of like the system worked in the past and we missed the olden days, of like, nah, we're moving forward and we're going to move forward with the revolution. Okay, so this thought reform was basically placed into Chinese society. um, People who were encouraged to basically confess their past mistakes, often in public. If you were in the upper class, you were really forced to do that, especially if you were a landlord. And by 1952, teachers and students were basically loyal to the state and kind of just, you know, did what it needed to do for the better of the revolution. But that's it. And that's all for your notes. Bye.